My name's Mary Newberger. For those of you who don't know me, I am a historian of Bulgaria and Southeastern Europe here at UT. I am also the director of the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies and the chair of Slavic and Eurasian Studies. And I am your co-host along with Kirill Abramov.
Thank you very much, Professor Newberger. And for those who do not know me, my name is Kirill Avramov, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Texas, part of the Department of Slavic and Eurasian Studies. And my interests fall within political and security development on the Balkans, but I'm also excited about all the issues pertaining to anthropology, history, and culture. Dr. Newberger, I believe that our guest today will be introduced by our colleague, Chelsea.
Chelsea Westohuri, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Slavic and Eurasian Studies, will introduce our guest. And I'm so excited every Friday I learn something new about the Balkans. So I hope today will not be an exception. Take it away, Chelsea.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chelsea Westohuri. I'm assistant professor in Slavic and Eurasian Studies, and I have the pleasure of introducing our guest today, Dr. Sunnie Rucker-Chang, who is an assistant professor of Slavic and East European Studies and the director of European Studies at the University of Cincinnati. She works, writes, and teaches primarily on racial and cultural formations and minority-majority relations in Southeast Europe. In her interdisciplinary work, she focuses on Yugoslav and post-Yugoslav history, literature, screen media, coloniality, and post-socialism. She is the co-author of a recently published book, Roma Rights and Civil Rights, a Transatlantic Comparison, and co-editor of Chinese Migrants in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. She's also currently finishing a monograph tentatively titled Discourses on Blackness in Yugoslavia, Legacies, Legacies and Dimensions of an Idea, which challenges conventional ideas of race and racialization in the Balkans and connects the region to broad trends in European studies. I have had the pleasure so far of collaborating with Sunnie on a couple of things, including a recent panel at ACES, and I am just so excited for the treat we have in store today for the Balkan Circle. So Sunnie, take it away. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I apologize for all of the technical challenges and for sharing my screen a bit early. I was having more technical challenges, so what a way to end the week and almost the semester. Anyhow, so thank you all for taking the time to join me for my talk. Thank you, Dr. Westohuri, for the kind invitation, the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies for hosting the talk, and many thanks to anyone who helped with logistics. Today, I'm going to be talking about Romani representation in Southeast European film with the goal of shedding light on who are considered Roma, as well as how members of Romani communities are represented in media and some of the differences between self and outside representation. So now would probably be a good time to start sharing my screen. So let's see. And I cannot see the screen.
We can.
Okay.
Yeah, we can see the screen.
Right, okay, so as long as you can see it, then we're all in a good place. Okay. So first, okay, this is an interesting place to be in, but it's fine, it will work. So first question that we have to ask in this presentation is, who are Roma, right? And I think that for the people who are in attendance, and definitely for the people who introduced me, this is not a concept that is an unusual question to ask, or it is an unknown. But for those of you who are in attendance, maybe you don't know much about it, so I will give some basic information about it, about them. Roma have been determined to be an Indic people who migrated to Europe in the 12th century and who have been systematically marginalized in their societies for generations. In Romania, for example, they were enslaved until 1865, and during World War II, they were marked for systemic extermination by Nazis and other fascist regimes in Eastern Europe. They've been the subject of racism, school segregation, unequal opportunities, and various forms of exclusion throughout Eastern European states. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with who are considered to be among Romani communities, I offer this map, which I find very useful. This wheel here is a symbol, historic symbol of the itinerant historic nature of the Roma as itinerant people. And so the larger circle that you see represents a larger percentage of the population as Roma. So you can see this is just a European map. Obviously, if it were a global map, you'd have circles all over, but we're speaking about Southeast Europe and Europe in particular. So you will see the larger circles correspond to a larger percentage of Romani communities within these countries. And I want to focus here or stress the fact that I'm saying Romani communities because even though Roma is considered to be an ethnonym, in many ways it incorporates many cultures, many groups that do not consider themselves to be Roma, and therefore it also becomes a political term. Thereby, you will hear me say members of Romani communities as a result. And when we talk about Roma within the role of the societies that they live in, the projection is frequently one of otherness, and they are frequently portrayed as strangers. And I will talk a little bit more about who I'm using in reference to talk about these ideas. And in many ways, because of their projection of otherness or foreignness, they're subjected to the same scrutiny and exclusionary practices as some other populations, despite this being the countries that they were raised and born in. So this is their home countries, but they're being treated as outsiders. And this projection of otherness shows up in jokes, cultural biases and stereotypes, as well as a repository for cultural fears and concerns, which we can see on display in film. And it has long been reinforced through scholarship as well, that engages with Romani populations through primary lenses of culture, folklore, and origins, which also tends to romanticize or has historically tended to romanticize Romani populations and further reinforces their difference. Further problematizing these representations are that they have frequently come from outside the community, which has rendered these depictions and easily described as inaccurate and inauthentic, and at worst, an exercise in fetishizing and perpetuating the ideas that Roma cannot be a part of mainstream society. And I'd like to draw our attention here to a book by Aidan McGarry called Anti-Roma, that points to the idea that anti-Roma racism is one of the last forms of acceptable racism throughout Europe. And the image here that I included as an example of this is a campaign that happened in Romania where there was an active attempt to try to get Roma to change the name of their population because it was feared that people would confuse Romanians and Roma, and by some members of the population that was deemed unacceptable. And so people are really standing up and talking back and saying, you know, I am Roma, right? So sorry to run back through these here. So when we talk about the representation of Roma in film, I always find it very useful to return to Stuart Hall and his reinterpretation of the communication model of encoding and decoding. And through Stuart Hall's framework, we reveal how images are created for and processed by the viewing public, which opens a space for individual interpretations beyond what is described by dominant constructs. And that is to say that images work unconsciously to reinforce ideologies, and ideologies produce social consciousness, so that they can be taken for granted as true and appear on screen as natural. So that is to say that when we view people on screen, and this is particularly true for marginalized communities and not just Romani communities, but we are viewing those images through a set of filters and sign systems that we carry with us. So this is particularly problematic if we are unfamiliar with members of a particular marginalized community. So we see these images over and over, they become reinforced, and you have certain ideas that persist about these particular communities. And so they become true, they become real. Right? And so because of this, very few images are without meaning and significance to the viewer. In fact, I would venture to say that for many, maybe most in this crowd, the word Roma, Romani, or even the other pejorative term that I will not use associated with this group that I'm looking at here conjures certain images or associations. And we can see these images and be presented and reinforced through films. So For many viewers of these films, Roma and Romani representation evokes images and associations with difference, as I've said in the beginning, that for the majority, and an otherness that is not theirs, and therefore something that can become a vessel into which ideas, many of which are pejorative, can be projected and expressed. Therefore, Roma in films are rarely just people telling their stories or representing their experiences. They are signs or symbols for something else. So looking at some of the way that scholars have talked about Romani representation in film, I'd like to draw our attention to a few notable scholars throughout the 2000s, and then I also have an example from the late 90s, namely Dina Yordanova and Aniko Emre, who examine the idea that Romani people are allegorical representations of the nation, right? Dina Yordanova primarily looking at former Yugoslav countries, Aniko Emre primarily looking at Hungary, but in both of these images, both of these portrayals, both of these discussions, they are looking at images of Roma as being symbolic, right? So Dina Yordanova says that when we are looking at Roma, we're actually looking at ourselves as not ourselves, me as a member of that, but when members or people in the Balkans are looking at representations or images of Roma, what they're really seeing is, or projecting a sense of self as being different from Eastern Europe. And then when, in Aniko Emre's writing, she's looking at the projections of Roma as being a way for Central European film to project an image or at least express aspects of whiteness, and showing Romani as being very far from that. Then we have Nikolina Dobrova from 2007, who looks at these constructed ideas of who Roma are as very much false and very much a romanticized image that has no ground in reality. And then Aniko Emre further talks about these ideas as dancing slaves and people who are imagined as quite alike all over the world. So that is to say, there is nothing specific about them. There is nothing that we can extract from these images. Rather, it is one mass of individuals that cannot be differentiated. Further, Emre refers back to Bori from 1998, a Hungarian scholar, who says that in contrast with real ones, meaning Roma, who are extremely diverse in their languages, lifestyles, and values, the Roma that are presented are essentially symbols of something else, right? They are constructed characters and characterizations. And further, in 2015, quoting from Maria Bogdan, she uses the idea from Derrida as Roma as an outsider or a stranger that gets presented and reinterpreted and reinforced in media discourse. So in most of these films, and what I would like to be able to do in my own work is to track a history of progression or movement towards diverse representations. However, with increased interest have come new images and perhaps new character types, but it's very difficult to truly track some progression toward change. However, what you can see are some tropes and some ideas that get replicated from time to time that really do wind up being that are exemplifications of what the scholars that I highlighted in the previous slide are talking about, right? So we have this classic, and I'll get down to this 1967 film and sort of work my way backwards here. But 1981, Who's Singing Over There, we have this image of Roma as being outsiders. So thinking about what Bogdan is saying is Roma is always necessarily existing outside of society in these media portrayals. And Who's Singing Over There, which is very much a classic Yugoslav film. You have what is supposed to be a representation of a typical Yugoslav society, and the Roma exist in sort of a chorus form, narrating and discussing what has happened as they're traveling throughout the Serbian countryside, but they are always outside of the society. Now, the end of the film, we could maybe offer a different interpretation, but even at the end of the film, they are very much outside of society. The 1990 film by Mir Kusturica, Time of the Gypsies, you have these Romani characters who are seen to, are shown as possessing magic, these kind of mythical, magical abilities that somehow only exist within their community, which has been argued, I believe this, and it has been argued by others, that is just a way of reinforcing their marginalization and their difference, right? They're magical in some kind of way. And I know I'm going backwards chronologically, but it's because I want to show you this film clip. And you have in this 1967 Yugoslav film called I Even Met Happy Gypsies. And I apologize for using that word. I'm using that word in the context of the films that were created with that title. It's a film that's was directed by Alexander Petrovic. And in this film, the Roma predictably reside in pastoral landscape of Sombor, which is in northern Serbia, surrounded by mud, chaos, vulgarity, and criminality. Their existence, as it is framed in the film, stands in great contrast to Belgrade, which surfaces later in the film, as a cosmopolitan, progressive, tidy, and orderly city that offers an ideal setting for those who reside there, except for Roma. The Roma, by great contrast, beg for money or clean up trash in the city, but are relegated to living on the edges of the city. This 1967 film relates to other more contemporary films with large Roma cast, and that the mere presence of Roma on screen is encoded with a stable sign that casts Roma as inveterate internal outsiders. Given that one of the focal points of this cinema, which is an aspect or an example of Black Wave cinema, was to explore the, quote, symptoms of alienation in socialist society hidden in the discussion of progress and a better future, Roma are positioned in the film not as victors, but as victims of socialism, left behind in the construction of the new systems of Yugoslavia. These failures do not have to be directly articulated, however, because who else but Roma could so easily evoke difference and recall the failures and inadequacies of Yugoslav society, as they themselves are regularly positioned as relational to said failures. So that in many ways is the backdrop of the film. The clip that I want to show you, however, really ties back into this exoticization and fetishization of Roma as being these individuals that are just very much exoticized, right? And just have a difficult time holding back, and they're just prone to give into their passions. This clip that I'm going to show you features Bora, who is the main character in the film, and he's at a bar and he's just overtaken by emotions. I will warn you that it's slightly graphic and the sound quality in is terrible, but we're not necessarily watching it for the sound quality, but rather we're watching it for the action. So I'm going to go ahead and play this clip. Hopefully it's not too choppy and it works. So you can see in this film that you can see Bora as being very much overcome by emotion and just unable to control himself, very much exemplifying a stereotypical image of Roma that one might be able to see in these types of films, particularly as we saw through the commentary and the scholarship from film scholars in the previous slide. Now, in this film, Yugoslav film, there is a space to be argued that this is allegory, particularly as it is a Black wave film, as I said. However, it's very difficult when you start to see the different layerings that enter into this film to not see this as a continuation of the portrayal of marginalization of these communities. Further complicating this is that Bora is being played by a very important Yugoslav actor, Bekim Fehmiu, but he is not Rome and he is essentially acting in brownface, which is another trope that you see throughout these films. And so this added on top of sort of these stereotypical images really can give some insight into the way that Roma are presented in films, even in this relatively early example. So films with Romani cast have been arguably seen to be an exercise in the perpetuation of their otherness, as we bring with us our own prejudices and our sign systems that we relate with Romani communities. But remember, none of this is being offered in a vacuum if we return back to Stuart Hall. That is to say, when we see these images of Roma, as we see them as fixed as having these same types of characterizations, we start to build ideas about who Roma are, where they live, how they interact with one another, and that would challenge or sort of color our own perceptions of how these individuals might live, right? Because as we had from the Dobreva quote, they are not seen as just merely existing as individuals within their own communities, but rather symbols of something else, right? They're never just individuals, but rather symbols. So what I would like to do here, or what I try to do in my own research, is to examine similarities between social and cultural movements and change in the image of Black Americans on screen following the civil rights movement, and question if self-representation or a shift in images and engagement with history or contemporary developments have aided in the shifting image of Black Americans, and put that into relational frames with Romani representations to question if any shifts or changes in Romani representation have come as a result. And it is with this in mind, this theme in mind, that I will go into these next type of films. And I start here, and I know that it's a pretty large leap from 1967, but not so much of a large leap from 1990, to look at this film Roaming, which is a co-production. It's a Czech, Romanian, and Slovak production. But what you start to see is that the marginalization of Roma, particularly since the Eastern expansion of the EU 2004 and 2007, has become a matter of inquiry beyond the borders of Eastern Europe. And as a result, it is requiring new questions to be asked and even new frames of reference to be considered. Perhaps most importantly, it requires the input of Romani voices, experiences, and expressions to talk back, as I recall one of UT Austin's own, Ian Hancock, to the structures of racism and marginalization. In the final examples that I will show you in this talk, and I will work through them, it's possible to see a shift in some representation of Romani experiences and re-examination of the sources of ongoing Romani marginalization to create new questions and new ways of seeing members of Romani communities as being both of and in Europe. And so this clip here from the 2007 film Roaming is one that I like to show in order to show some of the relations between center and periphery and how they're starting to inform the image and the questions that are being asked when we are looking at Romani communities in film. And I'll play this short clip for you here so you can see how the movement is becoming, or the movement of questions is one that is being a question of Europeanization rather than situated marginalization within Eastern Europe or Southeast Europe, as the case may be in these films.
Co jste řekl? Ale že nebreči, jenom když hrajeme. Tak hrajte, no. Jistě máte povinné záchranné vybavení, že? Všechno mám.
Tak mi ukažte lékárničku.
Spokojenost.
A nůžky? Jsou nerezové?
Já nevím, já jsem na ně nechtěl.
Dejte si pozor na jazyk, pane řidiči.
Všichni slezte dolů.
A proč? Budete s náma na stanici kvůli evidenci autismu.
Jak evidenci? My jsme nic neprovedli.
Jo. Či pak jsou ty nástroje?
Naše?
Můžete prokázat jejich nabití?
Tak všechno dolů.
Jedem. Co to děláš?
Pojď tím.
Co si to řekl?
Jaký je tvoje evidenční číslo, když už si tykáme? Chceme podat stížnost, že parkujete na přechodu. Nebo to není vaše auto?
Juro, zavřou tě.
A taky si budeme stěžovat, že nás bezdůvodně chcete tát k nějaký nesmyslný evidenci. Moment.
Počkej, Viktore.
Doporučil bych vám mluvit slušně. Tenhle pán je romský zastupitel v Ústí nad Labem a delegát při parlamentu Evropské unie.
Je to pravda?
Samozřejmě, že je to pravda.
Myslím, že to on, že jsem viděl v televizi.
Tak já myslím, že pro dnešek to můžeme vyřešit blokovou pokutou na místě. Evidence asi není nutná.
Dobře, pánové, a za co? Mimochodem, přeslechl jsem vaše jména.
Pojďte.
Jste si tím jistí? My to zaplatíme.
Pojďte.
Jak myslíte?
So in this film, it's a little bit difficult because obviously you haven't seen the entire film, but what you can see is that there is a power dynamic, and Yora, the main character, throughout the film, you learn that he is he's very much educated, he's very much attached to urban spaces, and through his education, he's able to come back home and challenge some of these power structures that are an impediment to some of the other people in his community. And I like using roaming as an example, even though it's not entirely Southeast Europe, but it gives us some insight into this question of Eastern Europe, Western Europe, but also the place of Romani community within this center-periphery relationship. So moving on from the early 2000s, before you even get to the 2010s, I like to talk a little bit about contemporary representations and how these new contemporary representations are asking broader questions, right? They're not just looking at Romani marginalization or accepting Romani marginalization, and Roma are not simply signs or metaphors for bigger issues, but rather these films are looking at individual problems in which Roma happen to be characters in those roles, right? So here we have Just the Win, which is a film from Hungary in 2012, which is actually looking at murders that were targeting Romani communities. And this film, together with a 2018 film by a Roma director, Bogdan Arpad, is looking at how day-to-day racism and day-to-day marginalization affect Romani communities. So rather than placing Roma outside of the societies in which they live. It is looking at them as members of their communities and looking at maybe some of the roots and maybe some of the sources of their continued marginalization. If we move down to this 2016 film, Trapped by Law, by Kosovo Rome director Sami Mustafa, it's looking at questions of mobility or limited mobility for this particular duo of brothers, and how being Rome makes them liminal and makes them unable to move between these spaces very easily. They're trapped by law because even though they grew up in Germany, they do not have citizenship. So once they moved to Germany when they were children as refugees, but once Germany released them, they were no longer allowed to live there. They were forced to go back to a country that was not theirs. And so they wind up in Kosovo, and they're just very much lost, confused, and unsure about what to do to make their way back to a country that is actually theirs by culture, but not by law. And so in a film like Trapped by Law, it's much broader questions that are being answered or being asked. And maybe we're not necessarily getting answers, but we're seeing Roma as being individuals that are affected by problems that affect other people in general. This film, Aferem, is one that is not created by a Roma director. Neither is Just the Wind, by the way. But Aferem is an important film because it's one of the first that looks at Roma slavery in Romania. So when the film came out in 2015, the director Radu Jude said that this was a way to connect, to understand our present by way of our past, understand their present by way of their past, and to make the connections there. And in saying that, he is making an argument to say that there's very little progression that can happen without understanding the origins of Romani marginalization, which in the way that it's being presented in the film is through slavery. And something that is interesting maybe for this audience or in general is that the history of Roma slavery in Romania is not something that is a topic that many people know about. And so through films like Aferem, through some of the efforts of scholars such as Jacqueline Baba at Harvard University, there is a movement to connect these two pieces, right? In my own work, I look at a work like Aferem, and I draw it or make comparisons to films that came out in the 60s and 70s, namely a miniseries like Roots in the United States that gave the society pause and a time to reflect on what that history meant to the current moment. So I'm going to show you this clip from Aferem, and the film is about this father and son pair who are trying to capture someone who is considered to have been a slave, a slave that has run away. Sorry about that.
Arzul făcut dascăl, cum mă necăjește, umblă să mă învețe, grecul păsărește. Arzul făcut dascăl, cum mă necăjește, umblă să mă învețe, grecul păsărește. Tipto, 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 dăm-într-un însuflețit, este un neînsuflețit. Și dăm-într-un neînsuflețit, un însuflețit. Acceptă pe mine, orice supărare, să fii toată ziua, tot în gura mare. Acceptă pe mine, orice supărare, să fii toată ziua, tot în gura mare. Tipto, 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 tipto. Mai puțin se vor certa muiere decât bărbații pentru greșalele ce vor face, de vreme ce muiere este mai proastă și mai lesne spre cădere, din păcate. Arde-l făcut dascăl, cum mă necăjește, umblă să mă învețe, grecul păsărește. Acte bucurie, de pânceară mie, când văd pe câmpie, niște arată mie, căprioară, bucătoare, pepeliță zburătoare, cătăsărele cântătoare, ce mă chem la vânătoare.
And so following up from, not just following up, but along the same lines as Afrem, we have this new 2020 film that is from, oh, I forgot about to talk about Gypsy Queen, I apologize. So 2019, this film, Gypsy Queen, is very similar to Trapped by Law, where it is questions of center periphery, east and west, and mobility, but it is told through the story of the female protagonist, and again is really situating Romani stories within a European space and expanding the definition of how we can see, talk about, and ask questions about the marginalization of Roma. Something that's very interesting within this film is one where you start to have conversations about racial difference and what impact that has on the way that our protagonist and her children are meant to carry themselves so that they will not fall victim to stereotypes and racism, right? So interacting with, discussing the expectations that they should have for themselves as a racialized community, which then opens a much broader conversation about relational viewings, understandings, and differences between these communities. The final movie that I want to talk about, which I jumped the gun a little bit, is this 2020 film from Romania, A Letter of Forgiveness, which is the same actress here, Alina Sherban. In this short film, it's only 15 minutes, we get even more context and substance into some of the intricacies of Romanian slavery as it had an impact on members of the Romani community. I won't necessarily, well, I won't share the clip with you, but suffice to say, there's a lot of source material for thinking about the position of Roma in Romania now as it relates back to their enslavement and what effects and reverberation that has on the way that they're perceived and the way that they are outside of their communities. So these are contemporary representations. They are films that are moving away from the stereotypes to dig a little bit deeper, ask different questions, and project very diverse images of what is happening in Roma and situating them in today or situating them in the past to understand today. Finally, I would like to end with this resource for Roma, film about Roma. So it's films made by and about Roma. And this is a resource that was compiled by the director Sami Mustafa that I referenced earlier in my presentation. It's an incredible useful resource, particularly for those of you who are teaching classes that have Slavic and East European content. If we're looking at ways to diversify what we're teaching about, and not even just in our classes, but in any kind of presentations or workshops that we might do, this is a wonderful resource for locating films about Roma that are made by Roma, that is a curated list by a Romani director. And finally, I also want to draw your attention to the film festival Aketike that is going on right now. It would typically be happening in Berlin, which I guess technically it's still happening in Berlin. We just can't join them. So what they are doing is they are streaming all of their films. And it's a great opportunity to see some of these new contemporary representations that are moving away from stereotypes and from presenting Roma as outside of their communities and looking at the way that they are incorporated into their communities and the way that they're representing themselves. One of the beauties of this film festival is that you have Romani, primarily Romani directors of Romani films that are sharing their own experiences and they're providing their own insight, right? So we're getting away from these outside representations that can be rendered false or that can be easily questioned and engaging with members of their own community. So with that, I will go ahead and stop, and I would love any questions that you all have for me. If I can find you.
Thank you very much for this presentation. We really enjoyed it, and it's much needed. I'm going to pass the floor, the moderation, to Dr. Neuberger, and we will open certainly the floor for questions as some of the things that you have shown us, again, are very timely and deserve a deeper thought specifically from everyone who's dealing with the Balkans. Professor Neuberger?
Yeah, well, I want to open it up to questions here in a second, but maybe I will go ahead and ask one. So I guess just to kind of pull together the threads of what you're saying here, I mean, you're covering a lot of territory. This was a wonderful talk. Thank you so much. It was really interesting. I'm jotting down films that I want to see now, so that's exciting. I haven't actually seen that many of these, although I have seen Time of the Gypsies, for example. Classic. So I think this kind of marginality thread is, you know, really important to focus on, and also this exotic, you know, the creation of the exotic gypsy. But I'm wondering, like, is there a lot of, there's a thread of sameness in those kind of narratives, but then is there also significant variation that you can find, like, say, just sticking to kind of the socialist period over time? Is this something that we can see an evolution of? But then also I wanted to pick up on what you were saying about the kind of European trope and kind of Europeanness. And do you see this as fitting into the kind of notion of nesting Orientalisms that people have talked about, you know, whereby it's a way for non-Roma peoples of the Balkans to kind of assert their own Europeanness by sort of displacing, you know, perceptions of them coming from the outside as being backwards, sort of containing those by projecting them onto that population and basically saying, no, it's not us, it's them.
Yeah, so I'll try to work a little bit backwards, I guess. So in terms of the evolution of the image of Roma in cinema, so it's a really important question that you're posing. And I would have to say, through looking through catalogs of films and trying to get what I can and reading other scholarship on this, the general idea is that through the socialist period, you don't see that much variation, right? There's still Roma as being either commentators, which you see in the Yugoslav case, right, on what is wrong with society, or it's an in-depth look at, let's see, it's a sort of an ethnographic view of how Roma live their lives, which in and of itself is a form of exoticization, the way that it's performed. Not to say, broadly speaking, that an ethnographic approach is that in any shape, form, or fashion, but the way that it presents in these films is absolutely the case. In my work, I've looked at films from Hungary, I've looked from films from Czech Republic, Yugoslavia, of course, that's my primary area, and it seems to be this thread that runs throughout. So unfortunately, there's not a lot of variation there, right? And this is even against the backdrop of anti-racist ideology, right? But if you don't see a population as being defined by race or racism, then it's easy to say that this is just another ethnicity that we're looking at that way, which sort of gets us down a different path, but one that becomes relevant, particularly as we're looking at these films. So in terms of looking at them, looking at ourselves, which is actually the title, I think, of Didi Yordanova's chapter on this, right? If you look at films from the late 1990s that are coming out of former Yugoslavia, absolutely. I think you can absolutely make a case to say that these films are really about a projection of a question of where do we fit within the spectrum of Europe, right? And we're going to use this population that is clearly marked as other, right? We know that they are other to show that they are the ones, that they like us are outside of this entire European matrix. Contemporary films, however, are not doing that, right? And I think that that's where this question of self-representation versus outside representation becomes incredibly important. And I was in on a talk, I mean, we're all in talks multiple times a week these days, right? But in a talk a few weeks ago, where someone said that, yes, self-representation is important, but allies are important as well. I mean, I consider myself an ally, right? Because I'm not a member of these communities. But it's a matter of intent, and right? So if we're looking at the image of Romani communities as they surface in this film, particularly the Romanian films, I think are really fascinating, right? Where they're saying, if we really want to understand what's happening with the marginalization of our Romani communities, then we have to go back and we have to talk about slavery, right? Which in my own work, I say, I then tie relationally and say, look, this is what we did in the United States as well, right? In order to understand the sources of difference and distance, let's go back to look at history. So you see that in in Romanian films. The co-production Czech-Slovak and Romanian film that I showed you there, that I think the intent there in that film is wonderful, and it's looking at center periphery, the various diversity that exists within the Romani community. But the problem with that film is that one of the two main actors are not Roma themselves, right? So even if you have this really meaningful exploration of the Romani community, the diversity, and the various roles that they play within their community, when you have actors who are essentially jumping in and out of a culture that isn't theirs, but acting in that role, it becomes a bit of a challenge to see it any other way. So in the first instance, yes, but in contemporary films, I think we're getting a movement to something that is much different and allows us some insight into some of the intricacies of the communities, of the various Romani communities. Sorry for such a long answer.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. That's good to know. So if there are other questions, you can either physically raise your hand, but I might not be able to see you, or you can raise your hand in the participant. Oh, there we go. I see one. Yulia? Am I saying
Hi,
that right?
thank you so much for your talk. It was honestly very, very interesting, and I've written down a lot of things to have to look at. I'm Romanian myself, and so like this discussion is something that I have within my family circles and within the grander context, because there's still a lot of problems in the community. And I have two questions. First is if you've seen any evidence of this type of new shift in identity focused media to actually create tangible change in the way that this stereotyping is very prevalent in the community. And second was that you had mentioned how you compare this to Black films coming after the civil rights movement. And I was wondering if those parallels kind of tie into the first questions I had asked about the shifting stereotyping that is actually seen in society.
Yeah, so I think at least my goal in making these comparisons is to say that not to necessarily champion the American experience, because I think that for whatever championing we were able to do, we have to step back from that now and sort of give ourselves pause to think, well, what's happening here? But what I say is that the lessons that we can learn from the film of the 1970s, in particular in the late 60s, is one of self-representation and people deciding what the terms are for their own images and the way that they're portrayed in media, right? So what I think is starting to happen now within Romani cinema is you're getting more and more Romani directors who are sort of showing what they want you to see. But along with that, you're also having Romani scholars. So I hate that this conversation is happening in a vacuum, because it's not the case at all, right? Because along with these films, you also have Romani studies, critical Romani studies, Romani scholars, Romani movements. In Romania right now, in the last 2 months, there have been really powerful exhibits talking about eugenics movements in Romania and Romanian slavery, right? So all of these things are coming together. And I mentioned my colleagues at Harvard who are talking about reparations, who are talking about what happens when we don't examine the past, and thinking about offering apologies. So films are just one small part of what happened following the civil rights movement. And I think it's one small part of what is happening in Central Southeast Europe as well.
Terry, why don't you go ahead?
I can tell what I observed when I was in Romania. There was a town that we went through several times called Babadog, where it was, quote, a Roma town.
Mm-hmm.
The town was clean. There were a lot of brand new, large homes. And I was told that a lot of these homes were from Roma that had come in from other countries that had done well. And it was not something that you would say, oh Lord, these are people outside the realm. The town, as I said, it looked like other towns, but it apparently had a high population of Roma people. But I would also say that in many of the villages that we went through, no one said, well, this is the Roma section. You know, I don't, maybe there is a great segregation. This is in Eastern Romania, where we were on the Black Sea. But I guess if I wanted to think of Roma as having bandanas around their head and gold ear hoops, you know, I didn't see that. I didn't see that image that I think has been portrayed to a lot of the world. So
Yeah,
that's what
and
I observed.
Yeah, and thank you so much for your observations. I think that it is really important for people to have these interactions and to also see different images of Roma on screen so that we can step away from these stereotypical images, right? And fortunate for you, you were able to go be there on the ground and say, wait, what I've been told all these years just simply isn't true, because I can see it as something different. But if all you have are those images on the screen, then you don't know anything differently, right? And so by having varied images and varied perspectives, we get to have a much more diverse image of what we think about these communities. So thank you for sharing that.
Thank you very much. I see another hand, and it's Dr. Roberts. Jason?
Hi, thank you for this. So I'm hoping that you can give me some insight into something that I revisit periodically since 2006, when I was in Romania, in Bucharest on Fulbright. Right? And my project at the time was musicological and had to deal with folk music and folklore. So my experiences were put me in places where I would see a particular kind of representation, in fairness. I have two images that I dredged up from photographs that I took at the time. I don't know if I can share, but I'd love to, is that even possible?
I'm not sure.
Oh, well.
Hold on for a second.
Yeah, it should be. I just enabled participants to share screen.
Thank you.
And I
Dr.
made you a
Newberg.
co-host. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. I will show maybe the one, but and it's what does one do with this sort of thing? I assume you're seeing the couple holding the copper still. Yes.
Yes.
So this was at the folklore bazaar, I think is how it would translate. And I actually bought that still, and I'm very proud of it. What I noticed there, which I think that's every year in March, was a different kind of representation than I normally saw. I was taking a class at the university in Roma language, and this was one of my classmates. Now, granted, this photo was taken at a particular kind of folklore celebration, culture day sort of thing, very hearkening back to, socialist views of sort of a 19th century zoo version of folklore, where everybody does their folklore in their own little cage, right? But she sat in front of me in class and sort of enjoyed turning around, and this is all I needed to show you, and whipping out a tarot deck and trying to get a rise out of me. She was trying to I'm putting words in this, perform the magical gypsy, and I am confronted again and again with her choice of self-representation, the choice of self-representation that I saw at the folklore bazaar, and a conversation that I had with a gentleman on a train who was saying, Sunt Tsigan, vorbesk Tsiganeshte, I am Gypsy, I speak Gypsy. I could name for you and point out every pickpocket on the train. I mean, he could have just been getting a rise out of a foreigner, absolutely. But I recognize the currency in the otherness, and I recognize ways that it was deployed, and I recognize the position that they've been put in to need to deploy, to possibly a need to deploy that kind of currency. But then I haven't shown these photos in forever because of representation. And yet my experience of each one of these was confronting somebody's choice of self-representation when it is exactly the there be dragons of our academic discourse. It would be like meeting an actual magical black man. and what do you say? No, you're not?
Yeah.
How have you dealt with this in your, or how do you see academic discourse dealing with these spaces?
So I can tell you personally, the type of academic discourses that I have chosen to surround myself with recently have been ones that are critical, and that are using critical lenses to discuss representation, to discuss positions, to discuss marginalization, right? So I can honestly say I haven't had these types of experiences. I will say broadly, particularly, I can't speak for those individuals, and you know that, right? That's something I can't do. I can say that what my goal in my research is to explore and share as much of diversity as I can, knowing that there's a very broad spectrum. Being that I am not a member of this community, as you are expressing yourself, right, you're always overly aware of what you say, how you say it, and how it might be perceived from the outside as not a member. And so with that being the case, I tend not to even interact with or have experiences with what you're seeing. When I first got into this field, I will say that I was much more in that space and I was very uncomfortable with it. And so I decided to turn a different way, right? In a way that I knew I could engage with and be comfortable with. So I get what you're saying. I completely understand it. I wish I had a better answer for you.
Yeah, I appreciate your candor. I struggle against the self-critique that I am civilizing them in the same sort of thing that I'm trying to critique by leaving out examples in, okay, yeah. So there is no solution. The solution, I mean,
yeah,
that you're comfortable with, that, yeah.
Yeah, particularly. So one of the reasons why, I guess I could sort of backtrack here a little bit and say part of the reason why I became very interested in this is because it's very personal for me, right? So thinking about my own position as a Black American woman going into Eastern Europe, seeing parallels between my culture and another culture, representations inside, outside, and trying to figure out what can we learn from each other, right? So my positionality and where I'm entering into this is probably a bit different, which then also sort of puts our issues and our challenges in kind of different boxes as well. So, but it's important questions that you're asking.
Thank you very much for addressing them. I'm sorry, Dr. Roberts, it's just two other questions or two other hands are raised up. And at this point, I'm going to ask Dr. Vlad Baronia. Vlad?
Chelsea, I think Chelsea may have had her hand up first.
Oh, but... I'm sorry, I just saw that. Then, Chelsea and then Vlad. Thank you very much for pointing out.
Oh, okay. Well, before I go, because mine's in a different topic, Vlad, is yours connected at all to what we were just discussing, or?
No, I guess not, specifically.
Okay. I guess I was just thinking, so thanks so much for that talk, Sunnie. It was really great. I was thinking about pedagogy and teaching and how how we might be able to incorporate more films. And so I've already, I've taken more of the documentary film approach when showing films about Roma, because from my perspective, a lot of students need more of an introduction with some background. And so I've shown films like A People Uncounted a couple of times, in particular in teaching about the Holocaust, and especially since the Holocaust is so often framed in terms of, the Jewish Holocaust. And so, right, and so really thinking about the Perdaimos and how silenced the narrative is about what happened to Roma. And then I recently discovered through YouTube this film, In the Ghetto, about about the Roma of Stolipinovo. Did I say that right? Okay, yeah. And so I'm actually grading right now my students' response to the film. And again, this class was more about health and inequality anyway, so it fit really well in thinking about place and ghettoization. But I'm curious about how, for those of us that are incorporating a few films, in thinking about those kinds of documentary films versus, let's say, something like In the Wind or I had not seen Trapped by Law, but in thinking about how we use films to teach about the Roma experiences broadly. I'm just curious of your thoughts about that.
Yeah, so I teach an Intro to European Studies course, and the film that I have returned to pretty regularly has been Corcoro by Tony Gatliff. And I will be honest that this year it was just a big challenge to teach Corcoro because there was so much background information that I had to teach to get to the point of showing the film. But we wound up having a very good conversation about it, right? And talking about the silences around Roma and in the Holocaust, the silences around how many people had actually died and what it actually looked like, because Corcoro actually takes place in Vichy, France, which adds another level or another layer into sort of the silences around that. So I think that it really depends on the class, of course, because if I'm teaching a course on film, then I have many more, and I can talk about viewing otherness and screening minorities. But in terms of documentaries, I think documentaries are a really obviously rich resource, right? And there are so many more documentaries. And if anybody interested in this topic can go to the website that I provided at the end and find a number of documentaries to work with. Moreover, if you're working with documentaries, it's quite likely that you will find one that actually has a Romani director. And what's important to me is always centering Romani voices in my scholarship and in my teaching. So I think it depends on the type of course that you're teaching, but I do think that in our classes where we're talking about Central and Southeast Europe, I know that this comes as no surprise for anyone to hear me say this, but it's very important that we talk about the Romani experience. And the Holocaust is one that is incredibly important to highlight, as is Romanian slavery, right? Because these are two incredibly important facets of Romani history that have been erased from the record, right? But we can infuse them back into our classrooms through film, and it's a very easily accessible, digestible medium for our students as well. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this, and that was quite useful actually for all of us, I think. And thank you for providing the resources. And I certainly hadn't made a list here of movies that I have to catch up on. And at this point of time, I'm going to ask Glad. Thank you very much apologies, for mixing up the order, Chelsea. So nothing personal. It's just the camera that I see. Sometimes it's just the Zoom exhaustion, I guess, at this point of time. Vlad.
So yeah, thank you so much for your talk. That was really interesting. I just kind of a note on pedagogy. In my class, when I teach about Roma in the context of Southeastern Europe, I do it through music, and of course the Jelem Jelem, right? The anthem, right? I mean, it's such a powerful. First of all, there's such powerful recordings of that anthem, and we look at the lyrics and these performances, and it's very kind of with a lot of affect, and it really kind of brings it home for a lot of students who didn't really know about the Roma experience in the Holocaust. But I wanted to, in terms of your talk, I was just curious about kind of the narrative that you're constructing, and specifically, right, these kind of new Roma voices that are arising in cinema. And I'm just interested in your thoughts on sort of the commitment in these films to the European project, and specifically to the EU political project. Specifically because these films are funded, right, by
very much funded by
organizations, etc. And then thinking about, you know, sort of, I think you're absolutely right that in the socialist period, Roma representation in cinema in Yugoslavia was in many ways kind of mobilized in service of social allegory. You know, there's a lot of problematization and sort of erasure of the diversity of Roma experience in general that's there, and right, the problematic aspect of, you know, having these sort of, you know, Slavic Yugoslav directors representing Roma experience. But, you know, I'm thinking more of contemporary artists like Selma Selman, for example, right, who, right, is Roma, who, but, right, she is very much critical of the EU project, and in fact, right, references the socialist Yugoslav past, and even, you know, sort of brands herself as the new Tito, right, in her sort of performative projects. So I'm just wondering about, right, this kind of question of futurity and the kind of political horizon of this representation, right? And specifically because, you know, you reference, or you compare it to the experience of Black Americans in the civil rights movement, which, you know, in a sense, right, is tied to the American project that has also been recently questioned, right?
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah.
So I'm just interested to hear about, yeah, I guess this kind of, are these Roma directors and voices, are they specifically tied to the EU project? Do you see kind of an optimism around that? Or what is the kind of political space of appearance of these voices?
Yeah, so I think that, I mean, particularly with Sami Mustafa, I do believe that there is definitely a connection to the European project. And I think that the question of funding is one that's a very valid question to address and to talk about, because this is where the funding is coming from. But then there's also the age-old question of, is it better to have some representation than none, right? Which also has to be addressed as well. And in terms of thinking about the comparisons between Romani communities and African American communities, it's really interesting, because I feel like anytime I start writing something, by the time I get finished with it, I have to go back and say, but wait a minute, where are we now, and how can we use that as a critique, a form of self-critique? So yes, but I think that it's a very multi-layered, very there's various points of views on this, right? It just really depends on where you stand. So looking for films that are not necessarily tied to a European project are going to be difficult ones to find, simply because many, I mean, you mentioned Selma Salman, yes, but in looking at the films and looking at the organizations and looking at the scholarship that is being produced, most of it is very much with a European and an EU eye. And so since all of these instances, I talked about scholarship, I talked about film, I talked about even music is very much leaning toward movement in the direction of Europe. Yes, we can be critical of it, but I think that there's also a valid embrace in that as well, right? At least for some of these people and some of these directors. And in terms of the African-American case, yes, I'm still working on it. I'm still trying to figure out what to do with that. In our book that we just recently finished, where we're looking at Roma rights and civil rights and then looking at representation in various forms, we start out the project by saying, let's look at these movements, let's look at these groups of peoples and the marginalization of their struggles relationally, right? To see how one group got on the other side of this and one is still in the process, but by the time we finished writing the book, we had to say what we thought was a moment in time and was sort of a moment of movement toward progress wound up being something else. So I answer your question with an asterisk to say we will see what happens, but in recognition that there is a diversity of perspectives, and critique is a valid one. But yes, funding sources and who is making sure that these films get made is absolutely something to consider.
Thank you very much for addressing those questions, and I'm sure we're exhausting you because it was such an interesting and rich talk. And I'm going to ask for a last question or a remark from Chelsea before we finish our seminar today. Chelsea?
Oh, you're muted.
Yes, by now you think I know what I was. Before I do so, I just wanted to make sure there were no student questions or anybody else that wanted to ask a question before I asked my, okay. So I was curious too, we've talked a lot about film today. One thing I've been thinking about is television and representation in television. I am trying to decide to what extent I'm going to speak to this in my book, because there's a lot, especially when we think about comedic forms of television in Albania, there's a whole lot to work there about not even just Roma, but Black folks and representation of others in general. And I was just curious about how some of the more regional, local work around those issues ties to film.
Okay, so Aniko Emre would be the person who would be the person to ask about this, right? I'm not looking so much at television as I am films. I mean, as a matter of practicality, because they're just easier to get to, right? And also linguistically. So because I work in the space of former Yugoslavia, it's easily 5 countries that I'm personally working in, because I don't speak Albanian, right? But then you sort of keep getting bigger. And so as a practical matter, it's much easier for me to deal with film. But if you want to look at television shows and the representation of Roma, Aniko is definitely the person that would have a lot more useful commentary than I do right now. I do have one thing that I want to say that I've forgotten. I know my time is up, but I think that something that I didn't address but should be addressed is the role of COVID in representation, and then also in the continued marginalization and further marginalization of Romani communities in Eastern Europe. This doesn't address your question, but it's something that I felt that came to mind, and I wanted to make sure that I said something about it, because in the same way that there's progress that was been made, COVID in many ways has sort of made that backpedal. So not to answer your question, but as sort of a sidebar, something that I wanted to say. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Sunnie. This was such an original and interesting talk and topic. And I hope most of us are going to watch a Roma movie over Thanksgiving. Still deciding.
And then there's a commentary in the chat box about the Seattle Romanian Film Festival, which also has that film, A Letter of Forgiveness, available right now. Sorry.
Oh, excellent. Okay, so everybody check that out in the chat. There's a link there. This was great, so enlightening, so thought-provoking, especially when we connect it to our own history here in the United States. And I think that's a really productive way to kind of think deeper about these questions. And that wraps up our Balkan Circle for today. So, and for the semester. So hope to see some of you next semester. And Sunnie, you're certainly invited to come next semester to our series. We can send you the list. And if there's any sessions you want to come listen to, feel free to come.
Appreciate that. Thank you all.
All right.
Thank you very much.